Hi.
Hey.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right. Cool. So once a month, my dad asks me, do you have a girlfriend yet? Why don't you have a girlfriend? Do you want me to find you a really nice Indian girl for you to marry? And I say, probably not. I'd like to develop my own sense of relationships. I'd like to find a girlfriend myself. I think the norm that you get on opposition side of the house is one in which it is okay for parents to tell their kids who they should love. Is one in which it's okay for parents to tell their kids this is the kind of person that you should marry. Is one in which it becomes okay for people to feel guilty about who they love. On OG, we're very happy to say that shouldn't happen. The model for this is, I think, very, very simple. We're going to say you take apart and you take away any restriction that keeps people apart. We think this is anything from like removing socioeconomic and racial filters on dating apps like Tinder, The League. We think this is looking like improving housing complexes and doing housing reform so people can't discriminate based on race and class. We think this looks like increasing affirmative action policies for racial and ethnic minorities as well as socioeconomic minorities at universities to make sure overall more people start to meet each other. We think that the way you curb assortative mating is by making sure that more people are able to meet each other. We'll tell you about why that's very important. Two things I want to chat about today. First, why the norms are fundamentally coercive and why the government obligation is to restore this. Second, why you get massively more inequality on their side of the house. I'll also talk to you about why any other alternative designed to fix this just absolutely doesn't work. First, I want to talk about coercive norms. Why do we think, in the absence of a government policy that is designed to curb assortative mating, you get a norm that says you have to marry people who look like you, who have the same money as you, who go to the same school as you? I think there are several reasons for this. First, geographic pressures and literally the area in which you're located makes it much more likely that you meet the same group of people all your life. That is, if you live in a particular area that is dominated by one kind of ethnic group, you are always likely to meet these kinds of people. You don't change that until you get to our OG model. But second, I think it's just a nature of social pressure. That is, the pressure within your ethnic group, the pressure that comes from your community is to marry people that look like you. Like, from a young age, you're introduced to everyone in your specific community. Like, in diaspora communities in America, they're so tightly knit that I think what really happens is you know every Indian American in your city, or you know every Korean American in your city. The consequence of that is significant. You are always told that these are the sorts of people that you should marry. These are the sorts of people that you should form long-lasting relationships with, and I don't think you ever challenge that until we get to the model. I also think the specific context of parental influence is crucial, right? Like, obviously your parents want what's best for you, but the reason this norm develops is because parents think that marrying someone from your race, marrying someone from your income bracket is legitimately what's best for you. And I don't think kids ever want to cross their parents because either you do what your parents want or you risk alienating them entirely. This is a strong disincentive to kids ever doing anything to challenge their parents. The absence of this occurs when you have the kind of policy that says we're going to put people in different places, we're going to introduce new groups of people to each other. I think you only get that on government bench. Two reasons about why this is principally important for government to fix this. I'll actually take closing first though.
So, to clarify, it is your assumption that it becomes so much easier to ignore the existent social pressures that you say are acting on these people when you are around more people that are not like you, that you are going to aggregate any kind of meaningful impact to the extent that, like, there's some kind of social or personal change?
Yes. Cool. So I think the very intuitive reason for that is because right now, the reason you stick within your ethnic group is because that's literally what your entire community looks like. I think if you fragment that, I think if you change it, I think if you meet more new people, that is the point at which you actually get change. Two reasons about why it is principally important for government to fix this. First, I think the government just has an obligation to correct any sort of coercive norms that you have. That is, insofar as the community itself is deeply coercive and makes you choose people that you do not love and forces you out of a choice of marrying someone you love, I think it is the responsibility of the government to correct for any kind of coercive norm. But second and crucially, I think the government is the source of the vast majority of disenfranchisement that you get under this sort of situation, right? Like, redlining in the US kept black people together in a way from anyone else, which means they didn't find anyone else in their sorts of communities. The caste system in India literally separated people into different groups and said, you can't marry anyone who isn't in your religion. It's systems like this that overall mean that you just don't have, like, it's the government's fault that you have all these sorts of things, right? I think the government has a restorative obligation to change this sort of thing. I think that is important in and of itself on principle. Why do all other alternatives fail? That is, why can you never get any solvency or any solution for inequality or meaningful relationships? First, I think because the relationship, like your partner is the number one person in your life. They're the source of all your social life. It's where you derive a large majority of your connections, which means insofar that that person is always within the same group that you are, you never get to experience any other kind of new system. I think crucially what this means is that when you stay within one group and you never move out, people don't see the role models that they see within their own community operate in the same way that they do, which means you don't actually get mobility, you don't get the ability to change your kind of economic position. I think this also means that the highest classes are likely to prioritize each other. This looks like really rich people being able to get jobs on the basis of their girlfriend's dad working at a particular company. If your girlfriend's dad works at McKinsey, maybe you get an offer from McKinsey because that's what you really want to do. In and of itself, if we deconstruct the financial system, I think that's a win for us. So the last thing I want to say is that the notion that you have restrictions in the status quo, that is, there are restrictions on where people live, there are restrictions on who you can date, mean that there is literally never any ability to change this on their side of the house. You do not get the differences that you get until you get OG's policy. Why is this very good for us? Several reasons about why this shifts inequality. I think the biggest problem is that assortative mating tends to concentrate wealth at the highest levels. It looks like rich white people marrying one another and making sure that the wealth propagates down their bench. It's why you have the Rockefeller family that has just billions and billions of dollars that have lasted them for generations because they continually marry rich people. In and of itself, I think at the point where you desegregate economic and political capital, that is instantaneously a win for us. But I also think you get all the added benefits of contact theory. That is, the different groups coming into contact with each other is specifically more important at the point that you're forming meaningful relationships. A relationship is the best way to break down preconceived racial notions. It's at the point that you introduce your boyfriend or your girlfriend to your family at Thanksgiving dinner that you get the chance to address what your family's inner biases are, which means I think the contact theory in and of itself makes it much more likely that you see different groups actually coming into contact with another for the first time. You actually get some sort of change. Plus, I think it just makes people more likely to spread culture. You come into more contact with people, I think it means you can share more elements of your culture, you can share more things that are important to you. I think it's a win for us. I also think this crucially means that you increase the perspective that people have to optimize the relationships. Look, the thesis of opening government is this. Assortative mating means that there is a norm that says you have to marry someone in your group, in your race, in your income bracket. It means that anytime you choose to date someone outside of this, you feel bad and your entire community makes you feel bad because of it. We're very happy to say that governments should stop this from happening. We're very happy to propose. I welcome the leader of the opposition.
Everyone ready? I don't know about you, Aditya, but I prefer to pick who I love, myself, and on my own terms, not because the government gave me incentives to marry someone out of a different bracket, of a different race, even though I don't love them enough, and not because my parents told me to do so. But if the comparative you're giving us is really between our parents' advice and the government's coercive manipulation, I'd pick my parents over the government any day. Our first argument is about how the government doesn't have the purview to interfere in the realm of love and relationships. Second, about how assortative mating is good. And third, about how you don't actually solve the problems you seek to solve. First of all, about why love and relationships are a realm that is too private for the government to interfere in. I'll be integrating rebuttal throughout. Now they come to us and say that the government has an obligation to solve inequality. But the question really is, does the government's obligation to solve inequality mean that they can interfere in private lives? We think that the intuitive answer is no, right? Because otherwise, in your world, if you're only guided by the utilitarian aim of trying to reduce inequality, you would force couples of different income brackets to marry so that wealth gets perpetuated. But you obviously don't stand for that. So this shows that side government believes that the government's right to manipulate society to achieve economically efficacious outcomes isn't an absolute authority. Therefore, the question you should be asking is, what is the meaningful difference between literally forcing couples of different races to marry and putting pressure on them as side government does? We say that there isn't a difference, right? First, for a moment, let me pause for a moment to take a look at their model, right? We think that they opted for a really soft model that basically sounds like status quo of affirmative action, right? We're fine if you want to adopt a model of positive incentives, but if you're just adopting status quo, then you can't actually change anything or access any of the practical outcomes that you want. We think that instead you should be standing for stronger positive incentives, such as financial rewards for interracial couples who do marry, or giving subsidized housing to people who marry out of their income brackets, right? Not for the kind of like wishy-washy policy you stand for. But if OG really wants to make this debate just about policies that are basically the status quo, then we say that this debate will become just a purely principle clash about whether in principle is justified for the government to interfere in private lives. Now with that, I'll be moving on to our first argument, having shown you why the principle debate might actually become the most relevant clash in this debate. Okay, first of all, governments should not intervene in love and relationships. We think that the government only has a purview to intervene in things that have active, direct harms or benefits to society. And we think that your family, who you choose to love, who you choose to have sex with, has nothing to do with that at all. We think that we ought to restrict the government's ability to just intervene in people's ability to make free choices. We say that you are indeed restricting individuals' free choices in your world, and here is why. While you might not be directly pressuring people to marry people from another income bracket or another race, and while you might not be banning people from marrying people within the same race or income bracket, you are influencing the ability of individuals to make free choices. Now, we admit that in life, we always are subject to various circumstances that have nothing to do with our individual choice. For instance, where we choose to study at school might end up affecting who we choose to marry. But the fundamental difference is that that is dependent on naturally arising circumstances that are results of our choice. That is, I choose where I want to go to school, right? But the difference is that in your world, there's an active force of manipulation, right? If you're giving positive incentives for someone, like a cash reward, to marry someone out of their race, then that's no longer like a naturally arising influence on them. That is active manipulation. We think that these artificial constraints are not justified because they're actively taking away individuals' ability to make free choices. Let me give you an analogy, right? If I fire an arrow and the wind accidentally blows it to hit another person and therefore it kills them, you're not going to say that I caused that other person's death. But if you tell someone to put a huge fan next to the arrow that I'm firing, and therefore the arrow hits the person, you will say that I'm therefore responsible for that person's death. In the same way, in their world, government is responsible for restricting the free ability of people to choose who they want to marry. We think that this is fundamentally unjustified because they've not shown to us why governments should be able to interfere in the bedroom, in your private life, in your family, realms that are out of their realm of consideration and authority. Now, our second argument is about why assortative mating is good. We think this is important because if we prove to you that assortative mating is good, the government should not invest energy into banning it or curbing it. The reasons why marrying someone of your same background and the same identity group as you is important stem from the fact that relationships and marriage are extremely intimate things. They're often the sole source of support, of guidance, of energy, of love that someone has in their life. And it's therefore very important that the person they end up marrying and loving understands where they come from, understands their lived experiences, understands what it was like to grow up poor or a minority race, or on the converse, understands what it's like to grow up under your parents' shelter and having more money than you can spend, right? These are all things people talk about with their loved one, and we think that therefore it's like a good thing that people marry people sometimes with the same identity of them. Hold on a minute, I'll take closing right after I finish this point. And if it's good for people to find someone of a similar worldview and identity, the government shouldn't be curbing that. Yes?
This argument would be true if the government were forcing people to marry, but people are still consenting and choosing their partners. They're not going to marry someone unless they still deeply love them.
Yeah, you kind of just pointed out the problem with your whole case because it then doesn't actually bring about any practical outcomes, right? If people are already going to marry people who they love, then you don't need the government to intervene in having assortative mating. Therefore, if you're either actively changing something, therefore coercing people, or you're not changing anything, then you don't solve all the problems of inequality you talk about. Back to what I was talking about. It's very important, therefore, if you want to raise a stable household and raise your children well and have a loving marriage, to be able to identify with someone that you're with. Therefore, we think that it's enough that we've proved to you why assortative mating can be good. We don't think we needed to prove why it's better because our first argument is about non-interference, right? So if heterosexual and homosexual marriage, for instance, are both good things, then it stands to reason that the government shouldn't curb either one of them or incentivize bisexual people to do either one. Therefore, we prove that assortative mating and non-assortative mating are both good things, stands to reason that the government shouldn't curb either one of them. On to our final point about how you don't actually actually solve the root causes of the problem. First of all, we think you actively make the optics worse because now people will think that anyone who marries interracially or across class lines is only doing it for the government benefits, and that takes away all of the power that there is in having interracial couples stand as an example to society of integration and equality. Second of all, people are going to stop supporting progressive policies because of the massive political capital that's needed for your policy, because they think that all problems are already solved. The side OG seems to think is the case. But the problem with this is that you don't actually solve the root causes of inequality. All of the reasons that Aditya gave to you for why people still marry within their circle, like parental pressure, because of who you go to school with, because people sometimes want to marry other wealthy people to transfer wealth to each other, right? Still hold. And it's unclear why this changes, especially given the extremely soft line policy that doesn't actually give any real incentives for people. Therefore, all you're really doing is harming the optics of people who already marry interracially without causing any meaningful change for people who don't. We say the government should stay out of our private lives. Very proud to oppose.
I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Opening opposition completely misses the point of this debate and the point of our model. What we told you is that in the status quo, there are government restrictions that are actively keeping people apart from those that they love. It means that when people love someone, they feel guilty for getting into relationships with those people, and it also means people are never meeting the people that are different from the socioeconomic status and the class status and the racial status that they have. We told you these active restrictions that the government has placed on people now is what is actively preventing them from accessing these relationships, and that's why it's so important that these restrictions be taken down. This is not a soft model. We are telling you there's a problem in the status quo, and these restrictions need to be removed. What are these restrictions that need to be removed? The Vidya told you these are things like housing reform. There's active for separation of people and ghettoization of black communities, for example, or Hispanic communities, Latinx communities away from other races. We also told you this is things like in India, where there's government sponsorship of things like the class system and the caste system, which keep people from marrying within their caste. This is a huge problem, and it's something that's been propagated by government, which means one, the next opposition speech needs to answer the principled argument that Vidya gave you as to why the government has no right to keep these people apart and to keep these people from actually meeting each other, because like Aditya told you, the analysis here is that when people don't meet each other, they can't develop these meaningful relationships with one another that actually lead to mating, right? Like if you never meet someone from a different background, or you're always sheltered in these different isolated groups, you're not able to access that assortative mating that we think is so important. But secondarily, on this idea of interference, it means that if you buy any of their principled argumentation about why interference in relationships is bad, that is what they are doing. We are telling you the government is keeping people apart in the status quo, and that is why you need the radical shift that we are proposing to you on opening government. 3 things then. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about the importance of doing this and talking about private life and changing the way we interact within private life. Then I'm going to talk to you about the root cause of why there's inequality and how we're actually solving that in the long run. And then finally, I'm going to talk a bit about the contextualization of relationships. So first, on this idea of how this works in the private sphere and how you're actually going to change relationships. Look, this is a problem with individual relationships in 2 ways. Either A, you haven't met someone from a different background from you, and that means in terms of your potential optionality of people you could be in a relationship with, you've already been restricted. Maybe there's someone who's a different race than you or a different class than you that you'd be super compatible with, but too bad because you're never going to go to school with them, and too bad because you're never going to be able to live in the same housing as them because there's housing discrimination. We tell you that insofar as these are things that prevent you from accessing the total optionality of your life and the total self-actualization of your life, that is an active harm on an individual person. The second option that this could happen is when you love someone who is not from the same socioeconomic status or same racial background as you, and you don't actually are not able to enter a fulfilling relationship with them. This is things like normalizing these relationships and making them more common, making these people experience these relationships more, and one, thinking that they're okay and healthy and seeing the benefits that their kids or themselves receive from these relationships, and secondarily, it's things like not feeling guilty about it because it's not something that's as normal in society. Also note that regardless of if they win, that this is not going to be a huge change, the government has changed their active stance that they're taking on these relationships, right? Because when the government doesn't remove these restrictions, it means that the government is endorsing the belief that look, non-assortative mating is okay, it's okay to keep people apart. When the government shifts their stance, that actively sends a signal that this stuff is okay, this stuff is normal. That actually matters a lot in a relationship, right? Because if you're feeling really guilty because there's societal or cultural norms that have been created that make you feel like your relationship is not important, that actively prevents you from accessing any types of benefits that would be good for you. Is that time? My timer's up for him. Okay, on to the next set of argumentation. This is about why this is a good thing and actually changes the root cause of inequality and stuff like that. So, sure.
If someone meets someone who they love and respect, and they happen to be of the same race, is this really an active harm to society that the government should seek to prevent?
So firstly, we tell you on aggregate, if everyone does that, that is probably bad for society and bad to address that inequality point. But secondarily, again, we're not forcing interracial marriages. We're just saying that the government is actively restricting those things right now by their policies, and we need to remove those restrictions. But on my think it's on aggregate good for people to mix around. So, firstly note that in the case that someone makes the good argument that sometimes it's safe to be within your culture, those are people you relate to more, etc. Here's their response to that and why isn't that better on our side of the house. Firstly, we tell you that your identity as a person does not correspond to how well you're able to have a relationship with someone, and it doesn't correspond to how well you're able to empathize with them. So for example, I don't think it's true that just because your identity is one way, that necessarily precludes you from being able to access empathy with someone. Maybe that's one good option for you and it's something you like, but on aggregate, look, identity is one aspect of your experience, and your racial and class identity might inform one aspect of your experience, but there's plenty of other things that are important in relationships. You have to like the dates you go on, the bedroom is very important. All these sorts of things are important in terms of compatibility that are probably useful to be prioritized. Secondarily, in terms of aggregate cultural exchange, look, here's a problem. When there are voters that don't understand, when there's a problem in the status quo with political knowledge and access to what is most important for voters to do, and most important in terms of cultural exchange, that stratifies the inequality that we think is so problematic in society. The best way for people to be able to empathize and understand each other is through relationships, because like Aditya told you, a relationship is the foundation by which you really get to understand someone, you really get to empathize and love them and understand what their incentives are, where they come from, what their struggles are. If the people that you're in relationships with are consistently people that have the same struggles as you're going to keep believing the same things you believed before and never change your perspectives. But if you meet people and get in relationships with people that are different from you, you actually have the best incentive to actually understand and empathize with them. Note that the general contact theory argument doesn't get the benefits that we give you, which are more massive, because we tell you relationships are unique and that person is your partner, that person is your best friend, that person is the person that is there for you, that you teach your kids about when you're raising a family together. You really understand the ethnic challenges that they face, both through them and through your kids. This is literally the best method of cultural exchange and understanding, which means any step forward there is necessarily a step forward. The final thing to say here is that we just think this is going to optimize relationships overall. Just note that insofar as there's possibilities for relationships to exist and marrying people in the group, that's bad, and there's two ways we change that. Firstly, you literally meet more people, which means there's more likely to have, you're more likely to have more people that you have common relationships with, you expand your set of outcomes, that's bigger and better. Secondarily, just having changing norms or even having signaling that changes those norms means that you're more likely to be confident that those choices are the right thing. Why did Aditya's speech literally preclude the rest of the round? He told you that no other alternative will solve the root cause of this, which is that it stems in relationships and networks that prevent people from ever getting the sorts of resolutions of racial or class fracturing that occurs in the status quo. There has to be a start from the relationship, and so no other type of alternative legislation will work. We also told you that even if this doesn't work, the principled matter of this is the government restricting these people from meeting each other, which is the root cause of not having relationships, is bad. And finally, it's the only way to get meaningful cultural exchange. Whether you do this because you think people should be able to date in a more productive way, or you do it because you think it solves better class issues, we're very proud to propose.
I welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
It's good, it's good. If a government team interprets a motion in such a way that the opposition has to defend a caste system and literally state-supported discrimination, here's a hot take. Team government probably interpreted the motion wrong. So what do we support? We say government does reasonable things like not actively discriminate people because duh, Other than that, it doesn't do anything to stem this. So, what is our general stance? Anything extra to this is bad. And the main question is, should stemming assortative mating be the fundamental motivational factor behind this policy action? I will show that it should not be. Two broad points. First, is love the type of thing in which governments should be involved? Two, what are the effects of this policy? We say love is not the type of thing in which the government should be involved. The first reason that Cohen gives you is that there is a fundamental difference between naturally arising social factors, like you happen to live closer to people that might share the identity with you. There is a difference between that and someone actively taking a step in order to shape your relationship in one specific way. That is, that fact that there is personal agency in the people in government choosing to do this means that there is a fundamental moral difference between naturally arising constraints and artificially imposed constraints. We think that OG has simply not been able to deal with this argument. Insofar as that is true, it shows that even the mild incentives that we aren't really sure how they work, even that should be something that we oppose. That still stands in the round. The second thing we say is that some constraints are preferable to other constraints. Why? Because naturally arising constraints are the types of constraints that generally push people into better relationships. Cite government contests that your identity does not correspond to the compatibility between two people in a relationship. So our response is the following. This might be true at an individual level, but it is unclear why it is true on the aggregate, right? Because we think that people from a similar background generally have a greater capacity to understand where the sentiments from the other person is coming from. So it's definitely possible for individual people from two different backgrounds to be in a healthy relationship. It just so happens that on the aggregate, this is not so. Given that on the aggregate, assortative mating can lead to generally good outcomes, it is unclear why the government should actively fight against it. That deals with the response coming out of the DPM, therefore this point stands. All right. So insofar as that is true, we have proven that it is illegitimate for the government to be involved with this, and that it is not even a bad thing in the first place, which would be a premise upon which a better constructed government argument could justify such an intervention. But even if you don't buy that, let's look at the actual effects of this policy. So the first thing that we should note is that it is unclear why side government gets any of the solvency they talk about in terms of the actual social impacts. So they say, look, in the status quo, parents pressure their children into marrying people of similar identities as their families. But the thing is, if the only reasonable model that doesn't exist in the status quo is banning dating apps from having racial filters, it's unclear how this changes any social attitude. And if you're telling me that these social attitudes are deeply ingrained in family structures, that makes it especially hard to show that you lead to any change at all. But in any case, you have completely failed to engage with a comparative, which is people naturally relate more with people from similar backgrounds. Given that that is true, it is unclear how assortative mating even goes down under their side. But there's a very important point in terms of how we actually stem inequality that we don't think that they have actually engaged with. What is this point? There is a lost political capital when you pass any degree of whatever policies are available for a government team. The problem is that these types of policies are likely to be extremely visible and extremely easy to criticize because it is literally governments being involved in households and relationships. Before I get to the impact, yeah.
Sure. So we are perfectly fine adopting more aggressive, housing market reforms, more aggressive affirmative action. The principle that Tejal gave you was that past government disenfranchisement literally separated people from each other. Respond to that sort of principle first.
So it's a bit late to change your model in a POI after both speeches. But the other thing we say here is that past government decisions might have been made in the past, but the conditions that result from them are still naturally arising. So the fact that the source of a consequence was arbitrary doesn't mean that consequence itself was arbitrary, because then everything would be totally arbitrary and we couldn't be able to differentiate anything from anything else. All right, so what was the impact that I was getting to in regards to inequality? It's quite simple. There is widespread opposition to the government because of this specific policy. What this means is that you trade off more fundamental changes, like for example having more redistributive policies that actually change the sources of income inequality. Given that they haven't engaged with that, we think it's sufficient to show, look, opening opposition has shown that there is a decrease in the political capital to do other things. They may say, look, this impact is like somewhat marginal, okay, but whatever possible like government policies seem to be somewhat marginal anyway. So insofar as this debate is quite marginal, this just seems to be a significant impact that we should care about. But the second response that we give here is, if we buy OG's analysis that there is an incentive for wealthy families to generally want their children to be wealthy as well, this seems to be a situation in which wealthy families have an incentive to marry other wealthy families, regardless of what policies side government chooses to implement. So what that shows is that like the literal mechanisms they give us for why this is a problem are the mechanisms that show why they have no solvency. So it's unclear like how they can possibly like win the debate given those fundamental contradictions. The last point I want to talk about, also just note that this point about like that Tejal made about how people can't enter into relationships with people who are different than them ultimately doesn't stand in this round because it's unclear how they actually change social attitudes under their side of the house. But more importantly, it is unclear how this argument has any substantial impact. Because if you still end up marrying a person that you love, and that person happens to come from your identity, it is like less clear why that is a bad impact. The last argument presented here was this idea, when you have a bigger range of like people that you access, therefore you will end up making a better choice. The problem with this is that there is a finite amount of people that people can meet, and this amount is generally already met in the status quo, insofar as like, people are generally pretty social and active already, meaning like the maximum number of people they could consider as partners is probably pretty close to being met in the status quo. So what we show is, this policy is illegitimate, this policy leads to bad outcomes. What else does an OO need to do in order to win a debate? I really don't know. Thank you.
Member of government.
Think about the people that you're closest to and the people that you know. And ask yourself, honestly, how many of them are happy? How many of them love themselves? And how many of them are in relationships that are truly dynamic and interesting? We're going to shift the debate in closing. Look, we support the OG stance and the OG model, but what we want to do is justify a world in which OO were right, and we in the OG model had been like intense tax breaks or something like that to get people to marry people that were foundationally and fundamentally different from them, that had different lived experiences. What Dennis and I are going to argue is that the relationships that people build are foundationally more dynamic and more interesting, and that ultimately people will be much happier, and that itself is enough to justify government intervention. I'm going to do two things in the speech. First, I'm going to do extensive weighing and explain why I think that that is the most important issue. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why we actually think that these relationships are far preferable. So first, look, I think OG is right that discrimination, wealth disparities, things like that matter. But in CG, we ask why. They matter because they affect our happiness, our ability to live fulfilling lives, our ability to flourish. I know that this is not the usual sort of thing that we talk about, especially in a policy round. But I think what matters in this round is foundationally different than what matters in any other policy round. Like, OG does a great job explaining why wealth inequality is bad. But when the motion came up, the topic was love. There are lots of things the government can do that address wealth inequality, right? There are a whole litany of policies that exist, probably on both sides of the house, that address these kinds of issues. Sure, they're probably better, but we don't think that is what is at the core of this debate. Look, if we just cared about racism or inequality, we would just, increase the state taxes. But we think this particular mechanism is something that allows us to fundamentally change how people relate to one another on a deep and meaningful level. What we're going to bring you in this debate is courageous and bold. It is an explanation of relationships, of love, and human happiness, and why that is more, and why those things are better on our side of the house. Two things to note. First, people's partners in their relationships impact their quality of life far more than almost any other decision that they make. That is to say, in a welfare state, it is relatively few people that do suffer from, say, extreme poverty. The OG model probably doesn't fix that. But it's things like the contentment in your relationship that have a truly enormous impact on how happy you are. That is the person that you have to stay with every single night of your life for literally decades and decades. Secondly, what we say is that there is a massive problem in the status quo. People today are deeply unhappy despite being wealthier, despite the fact that racism has grown less severe, despite the fact that people's general living standards are so much better. The reason why, and I think it is no surprise that the divorce rate is also extremely high, people don't feel happy despite all the progress that has been made on these issues. And I think people also view things like marriage and commitment and dating with massive cynicism. People feel as if marriage is something that they get trapped in, not something that they want to be in for decades in their life. Look, here's what we would say. We would say that this happens because people are kept apart, both by the discrimination that has existed historically that side OG talks about, but also because people are just raised in an environment in which they literally cannot conceptualize marrying someone that has a fundamentally different lived experience. Now, I go to a Jewish university, and the vast majority of people that I talk to would say, look, I will literally refuse to date anyone that isn't Jewish because they couldn't possibly understand my lived experience. The argument that we're going to make now is why that is untrue and why it is likely that people's relationships will fulfill them more. First thing here, why is life worth living? Dennis and I would argue that it is about personal growth and learning. That is, the hedonic treadmill example shows us that it is not just how comfortably we live, but meaningful lives are one where when we are on our deathbed, we look back at our youth and we see someone who 40, 50 years ago was fundamentally different from yourself, and know that you have grown from that person and that you are happy with the life that you have lived. Ultimately, this is what matters to people. We say these relationships are likely to lead to that sort of outcome far more likely for three reasons. First of all, a person who has a completely different lived experience from you forces you to completely and foundationally reevaluate basic assumptions and beliefs that you might have. And this isn't just about race, like OG talks about, but things like humanity, politics, culture. That is to say, we all are born and raised in bubbles in which we grow to understand the world in certain ways. And when you experience life alongside someone who has grown up in a radically different environment, what it does is fundamentally change the way you refract experiences that you experience and internalize those kinds of things. Secondly, though, what we say is that this makes your marriage and your life far less monotonous. It leads to more variation and excitement. That is to say, if you marry someone from another culture or from another community, what will happen is you will inevitably travel. You will experience their traditions. You will have experiences that you literally could not have conceptualized in the past. The reason we hold so tightly to cultures that are their own are because they are deeply meaningful to us. But I think it is equally meaningful when you marry someone else and you experience their culture and you run to their beliefs and their value systems. I think that foundationally changes the way in which you view your own life. And I think that is deeply, deeply impactful. If closing has a POI, I would love to take it. All right, opening.
Even if you show that marrying someone different from you is good, we don't think you've shown why assortative mating is bad and therefore should be banned.
Cool. Few problems here. First of all, we're not banning assortative mating. More than that, though, and probably more at the core of the debate, right? The argument we are making is not just that people could have marriages that are more fulfilling. The argument we are making is that people's relationships and marriages are deeply unfulfilling in the status quo. And what we say is that causes the kind of displeasure and unhappiness that is equal, if not greater in many instances, to the other kinds of social ills we talk about in policy rounds, right? At that point, then, what we say is government intervention is just as justified to stop this sort of an issue, or at least to incentivize people to make decisions that are good without banning them from making ones that are bad, just as it would be to intervene for the arguments that OG gives us. If anything, it's more important. The last thing, though, is I think that when you engage with someone that has a foundationally different experience, it changes your understanding of yourself. Look, I grew up in an all-white town where I considered myself white. I ate the same food as them, I viewed the world in the same way as them. But when I came to college and I found people that were like me, that came from different cultures and had different experiences, it forced me to reevaluate my own identity. I think that this is broadly true. I think that people experience the world in ways that are narrow and don't necessarily find ways that actually help themselves self-actualize. Identity is constructed in contrast to other things. When you have a partner that has an identity that is different from you, that views identity in a different way, then I think what happens is you start to view yourself in a unique way that you never would have before. What we say is it is still possible to relate to people even when they come from different experiences. And look, you can still have friends and family that come and have lived experiences similar to yours. But what we say is the person that you marry or the person you're in a relationship with is a special sort of connection. And what we say is that connection must be with someone that is foundationally different from you. We say that leads people to be happy. And so for that reason, Dennis and I are incredibly proud to propose.
I welcome the member of opposition.
opening government tells you that if we solved xenophobia globally and abolished the caste system and undid millennia of oppression, we would be more love in the world. Well, fuck, why haven't we tried that? So the first reason is that like banning redlining does nothing after 100 years of established cultural enclaves and geographic segregation and the economic disenfranchisement of minority communities around the world. That is to say that because you make housing because you are not allowed to ban people of color from housing in wealthy neighborhoods, that doesn't change the 100 years of economic disenfranchisement that makes those places inaccessible to these people. They're not just going to start living on house swap and meeting new people just because they can. So the second issue comes from closing government when they say, well, no, the real problem is that everybody's trapped in unhappy marriages and nobody loves the people that they're with, especially not themselves. While that hurt me deeply and personally, I don't think that the actual reason for this is that they're not allowed or able to date somebody that is unlike them. Maybe it's because marriage is an economic trap. Maybe it's because people often engage in bad faith relationships. Maybe it's because love is not a prerequisite of marriage or relationships to begin with. So then what they tell you is that they just have new experiences. The problem is that while they tell you that this can change you, and they give personal anecdotal examples of how new experiences have changed them positively, what they don't tell you is why, on average, or generally speaking, or always, your engagement with new experiences will be value positive. The rest of my speech is going to explain why that's actively not the case. So opening half of this debate was largely a debate of rights, both impacted ultimately by choice. Who affords the most freedom in love? Speaker, love is not a prerequisite of the relationship. It is not a prerequisite of this debate. Relationships are not always equitable bastions of positivity. Opening opposition in response to this gives you a passive principle wherein they say, if there's not a good enough reason to do something, you should do nothing. This is not an offensive argument. They coupled it with mitigation. We're going to take this debate because we prove that this policy creates bad faith relationships and poisons what would otherwise be positive non-normative relationships, and that's why we're going to win this debate. First of all, the motion presumes that the vast majority of people do engage in assortative mating. They find that some people whom they, we do think that some people, as a result of this policy, whatever it looks like on the gov bench, may result in relationships that include love. I am not trying to straw man. I think that it is possible that people find love if their dating pool is increased by 10 people, which, for the record, is what we're talking about. Then, I tell you that this policy never gets off the ground, because in my response to opening government's case, when I talk about the problems with our model and why nothing is likely to change, what this means is that to begin with, most people still generally live and engage in communities that look like them. In places where this is not true, non-assortative pairings are already more likely. This means that any change garnered in this debate primarily occurs amongst people who would have otherwise lived in insular communities. To the extent that they still do, I don't think that a whole lot of change occurs. What it means is that there's a limited pool of people to choose relationships from, but secondarily and more specifically, also people who engage in assortative mating are generally people with a series of predisposed prejudices and biases. Whether this is because they live and engage in an insular community, or whether or not the causal relationship extends the other way, which is to say that they choose to live in an insular community or choose to engage in assortative mating because they have these prejudices and biases. These are generally characteristics of people who engage in this round. And understand that that's a tenet of government case. To the extent that they talk about social change and personal change and your willingness to engage in new experiences and learn things about people that you didn't know before, that you were changing something meaningful about yourself, is a prerequisite that those were inaccessible and value negative to you beforehand. Otherwise, there's no real change in the world. What this means is that these are the kinds of people that we're talking about in this debate. So what does it look like when every person that you enter a relationship with is somebody whom you have predisposed prejudices and biases to? And then in the middle of this argument, I'm going to tell you why this policy specifically and uniquely makes those kinds of relationships worse. So I'll flag that for you again when I get there. But what does it look like? It means that from the point of meeting someone through to the point of marrying and living with them, you enter this relationship disincentivized to respect someone. To clarify, people are historically and empirically more than willing to enter bad faith relationships. Millennia of sexist men entering marriages with women that they do not respect, that they do not garner empathy with or meaningfully engage with because they would rather be married alone, means that people are more than willing to self-select into bad faith relationships. Now, what I'm telling you this for is because the direct impact of the government case is to increase the likelihood of people entering into bad faith relationships by increasing the encounters between people's prejudices prejudices and their desires. What this means is that these relationships don't often feature things like healthy conversation. They don't feature respect. They feature dismissiveness, internal stereotyping, lack of effective conflict resolution. These are relationships that fight far more often than they love each other. This is actually especially pernicious, and this is where we get back specifically to the model and the government endorsement of these kinds of relationships. Because when the government endorses these relationships without any context, assigns a social value positive to simply being in a non-normative relationship, then you are significantly less likely to ever engage with your own biases than you would be in the status quo if you had chosen to enter a non-normative relationship on your own, because you have granted yourself from the word of the government a moral high ground. Engaging with your biases and prejudices is an incredibly uncomfortable, difficult thing to do. When you are given an easy out by one of the most ethos-driven authority figures in the world, you are incredibly unlikely to ever do that, meaning that it poisons any non-normative relationships that would have existed otherwise back half.
Cool. The logical extension of this argument is that because these kinds of relationships are bad, the government ought to incentivize people to assort. That is to say, have tax breaks to marry people that are like them. That is the logical extent of the argument you have just made.
It's super clear that you were standing for that same POI before I said the last 30 seconds of what I said, which is to say that if this actively makes what would otherwise be good non-normative relationships bad, then we have a net loss of any of the government impacts on this side of the debate. So, then we tell you that it goes further than this. If you're not generating empathy and you're in fact generating resentment for one another, you're less happy. This engages directly with the clash up and down the government bench, despite the weird model wobbliness. Then they have children who internalize the messages, the fighting, the disenfranchisement, the prejudices of their parents, and they go on to live those lives as well. We tell you that this also engages with CG. To the extent that you engage with these other experiences less positively than you ever would have before, this is where their failing was in their case. They didn't prove to you that these were necessarily positive engagements. What I'm telling you is that they're more likely than ever before to be value negative engagements. So on the comparative, through assortative mating, you are less likely to coerce bad faith relationships. On net, the more similar someone is to you, the less likely you are to be prejudiced towards them, the more likely you are to enter good faith relationships and meaningful real love. Government stops this and stops positive non-normative relationships from accruing. We think that on net, even though this is like somewhat of a low-level impact debate, you have fewer relationships that are positive engagement with the other. We have an increase in general xenophobia, cultural and personal resentment internalized through generations of infighting.
Welcome to Governor Whip.
Is everyone ready? If true happiness is the full and realized expectations of my preferences when they are most satisfied, then I, right now in this society, will never be truly happy. Why? Because I will never know what I currently as a one-dimensional man could ever want. I don't know my preferences because they are like tainted with the ideas of society, what my parents have told me, what the media has told me, what the state has told me, what I've read has told me. This isn't just about removing unhappy marriages. It's about being able to self-actualize, to be able to have these states resist the kinds of pressures that make it so that I feel coerced to make the kinds of choices that the entire op bench thinks aren't a problem. I'm going to do two things in this speech. First, I'm going to talk about how we make people happier. How we make people happier beyond just like what the straw man out of the member of op is that like, people will be in unhappier marriages. That wasn't what Ravi told you. Secondly, I'm going to address what OO tells you about can the state do this and like that kind of chat, right? Not just can the state do this, but why the state should do this and how this is unique from what we get from opening government. So first, how do we make people happier? And not just like, how do we make society writ large? Because I know debaters like to talk about utility a lot in the way of like money and these kinds of things. And yes, with any motion, you could say we're going to do the motion, but also do a 40% like tax or something like that, right? Like we're going to actually talk about how we make the individual person happier. We bring you three things from closing government, all of which are strawmanned away by saying, yeah, this is like probably just like unhappy marriages or something like that. First thing we tell you is about learning, right? That, like, look, when you are able to broaden your worldviews, this allows you to know more about the world and other people's struggles, an extension of the kinds of things we get from opening government. But secondly, we think that beyond knowing the struggles of other people, you get to know your own preferences better, right? Like, I think there's a difference between marrying the kind of person that you always imagined you were going to marry from when you were 5, when a white girl at age 5 imagines she's going to be marrying Prince Charming, who's another white boy, for her whole life. I think that when you marry someone else and it breaks down that expectation, you go, wow, I wasn't that kind of person. Wow, I'm completely different. That is a huge amount of utility. Third is this kind of contact theory argument, but an expansion upon it. What do I mean by this? Look, I get to know myself better, and I get to be a better person when I left the town of Atherton in California that was 95% white and moved to Boston. But that is like 0.1% of the kind of growth you can experience when you have to share your Netflix password with someone, when you have to raise a child with someone. I think this is the deep kind of utility you get when you say, wow, I thought I could never marry this kind of person. This is a very selfish extension from CG, and I want to focus not so much on the understanding of other people or fixing society writ large like OG tells you, but about how this affects that individual person, and we think that that is okay. The response to the one quibble we get from the up bench, from the MO, these will be worse relationships because people will just be too racist. That's not the debate, guys. OG clarifies this for you. If you are a super racist person, you're not going to marry someone. What is the clarification I'm going to bring you? The clarification I'm going to bring you is that this isn't about forcing a Westboro Baptist church person to engage in a gay marriage. This is about a person who had a parent that said, hey, I don't want you to do this, and we give them an incentive, we give them an out, we give them a resistance against this kind of thing because it's the kind of person who could conceptualize loving a person differently from themselves, but needs to resist the kinds of societal pressures that have been ingrained in them since they were 2 years old. I'll take back half.
Happiness exists on a referential spectrum to the things that I have experienced and how I can interpret those. The new experiences that you're describing will never impact my ability to experience a certain level of happiness if I never experience them, and so I have the same capacity for love and happiness that I had before.
I think the POI is if I never end up marrying that other person, then I won't feel that utility. But our case is that you end up marrying the other person. This is a weird tautological POI. They needed to explain why you don't meet that person in the first place, at the point where for some people this is a meaningful tipping point upon which you get this hermeneutic learning experience. We're still winning the fucking round. Okay, the second question on why can the state do this? I think this is deeply unique from direct cash transfers or whatever we're getting out of opening, right? Because it's not just restoring old harms. I think it is the state making it so that look, no amount of money you give to people can make it so that they can have the kind of experience we're giving you. That's the framing that Ravi gives you, right? The framing that Ravi gives you is that in the hedonic treadmill, the word utility we use never actually makes people happier because you just get used to what it's like to have more money. You just get used to what it's like to have a different social status and everything. Also, I don't think that's the motion. What we're telling you is that when you are living with someone for the rest of your life over these decades, you are constantly learning new things because you don't get tired of expanding the way that you see the world. You don't get tired of learning and growing and becoming a different person. And that was stripped from people by the state. So why is this more unique than just paying people off, which is kind of what OG says? What we do is we directly address those harms. We directly address the harms that the state gave because we are attacking it at the source. That's the framing we needed. Now I'm going to respond to what OO says and this thing about how but it shouldn't be the state, right? So look, this is going to be a little controversial, but I think that when they give you the broad policy that the state just shouldn't interfere with love and relationships at all, that means things like Obergefell and Hodges would be wrong on their side of the house. That means that when the state legalizes interracial marriage, that would be wrong because that's the state stepping in. That means when the state recognizes marriages and gives tax credits for these kinds of things, that would be wrong because that is the state taking a stance on marriage and recognizing it and codifying it in society. They can't have it both ways. They can't just have it and this broad policy they needed to clarify when it is okay for the state to interfere in these relationships and when it's not. This broad policy doesn't work at the point where we tell you that the way that we interfere with these relationships is a positive one, that you can only know your preferences when you exist in an equilibrium where the pressures from the state balance out the pressures from society. You don't have that on their side of the house. The world that they're talking about is one that doesn't engage with the fact that they're never able to meaningfully make their own choices on their side of the house, and they're literally OO is just I get to choose, so that's okay, but I just don't think they ever meaningfully were able to. I think that they just never had that choice in the first place, and the only way we can unlock that is on our side of the house when we resist the kinds of pressures that make it so that you think you wanted to marry someone just like yourself when you actually didn't. I reject the idea that you were born wanting to marry a person, Mr. Speaker. I reject that on face. We think that you wanted to marry a person who is good, and all other things are societal. At the point where you believe that that is true, Robbie and I are the only ones in the round who tell you what that societal shit shouldn't matter. And just because those are your preferences now don't mean those are preferences that are endemic to you. Very proud to propose.
The opposition whip.
Am I audible? Okay. When a sexist, or at least a closeted sexist, or a somewhat sexist man marries a woman, they don't have a sudden realization that, hey, this individual comes from a background that is so different to the life that I've lived, so different from the fundamental assumptions that I've had to make my whole life. What it's like to be treated by people in society, what it's like to move in society forward, they don't come to that realization. You know what happens? They become a benevolent sexist, because now they can defend themselves. Like when someone gets accused of sexual assault, they can say, no, I've treated my wife amazingly well, right? I see eye to eye with my wife every single day. They can use it as a shield to defend themselves from critique of their sexism, and to reinforce their sexism, and to confirm that again and again and again, and only making it worse, right? So everything that the closing government side tells you is categorically false. One, because it's simply not true that they'll be different from you in the first place, right? To the degree that they want them to be. They want always the polar opposite person that you need to create this realization. Because one, when people naturally self-select based on the similarities, when they don't have similarities on the base of their ethnicity and class and so on, they will look for ideological similarities in their beliefs and thought patterns, and this means that they simply don't get any of the more fundamental benefits that they want, like rethinking your whole life because your girlfriend told you something that blow your mind, right? We see that simply doesn't happen because they look for the similarity in terms of what they think, right? So we therefore see it even in the best case of closing, right? With the best case, if you are challenged on what it means to live your life, how are you going to weigh and react to that challenge? That challenge is based on how you have viewed happiness up until that point, right? That means, for example, you may have had like an upbringing where the ideal life was coming home to a nice cooked meal by your wife, right? Or other like sexist and misogynist norms built into you from that upbringing. That means it directly clashes with what you think an ideal and happy life is, right? And to challenge that to someone to be the core is something that they have not proven in this burden of this debate on why that will be shaped, because they have not proved why the fundamental beliefs are being challenged, and instead something that's radically different will be suddenly viewed as positive. We therefore don't see how that's the case. Not taken. So we therefore tell you on the other side of the upper them, we said that they're in a double bind, right? Either it's so efficacious that it's coercive and it defeats their arguments of why we should reduce coercion, and also on the other hand, they would rather want this to have like benefits. However, these are contingent on the relationship being healthy, having like the bare modicum of respect, having been able to like see eye to eye with the other person and not entering into it with the idea and the assumption I'm doing so because I should or because I want to. What does Ben specifically bring in this debate? That understand that there isn't a gate that you have to enter a relationship where, hey, do I respect this other person? That means though the vast majority of people harbor at least some degrees of prejudice towards people who are different than them, we say that this continues in their case as well. How is this the case? Because people are not what they seem, and they like trick each other to enter the relationship in the first place. Like you don't show your true self on your Tinder's first date. At least I don't. So in this case, we see that often the opposite is true, right? You prefer company, or at least some form of company, to being alone because of immense social pressures and like sexual frustration of being alone, right? We therefore see that they're willing to compromise on this case, and this compromise is immensely harmful. What does it look like? This means the privileged perceive the underprivileged as being more easily taken advantage of, right? That's exactly what Ben tells you. When you enter into these relationships with built-in prejudices and built-in biases, which is important because these are the groups that are most likely to be affected, people who like lived in insular communities who grew up with these sort of ideas and beliefs in the first place, right? What does this therefore look like? and understand that in this debate, it is a privilege for you to think of the word relationship and think of something positive, right? When there are untold numbers of people in abusive and harmful and simply like unhappy and unrespectful relationships, when the first thing that's what comes to their mind. Why do they matter in this debate? Because understand that when you give these relationships the veneer of doing social good, which is all the rhetoric that all this team wants, that these relationships are making society better. What this means is that you give them a veneer that cannot be broken and makes it simply much harder to fix a problem. Because one, these individuals in the relationship are less likely to realize when they're being disrespectful at the very minimum and on the man abusive at the very maximum, right? They're less likely to realize that's happening. Second, they're less likely to report that when it does happen, right? They're simply because they think they're in a relationship that's doing good and it's doing good for other people. This means it's, and this is literally the definition of gaslighting, right? This means when you think that your experiences in relationship are invalidated because you're supposed to be doing something good and you're supposed to be doing something that's beneficial for society. This creates immense psychological damage and continued harms in most relationships, if not at the level of direct abuse, and that simply means of denigrating someone on a daily basis, right? And we don't stand for that on any level of extent of how it happens. And we also see, therefore, not taken, how it's harder to make that change happen. Why? Because before I move on to this point, I'll take opening.
So, OG told you that assortative relationships are the root cause of social stratification. They propagate discrimination. Only targeting relationships gives you any opportunity to create social change or improve relationships, so the government must take action for its past failures.
There's a million different ways to fight like classism and racism and stuff. What doesn't help is creating benevolent classism and benevolent sexism that is much harder to fight against any and all methods that we want in this debate, right? We have to prove to you that you make solving the problems worse, not give you a magic solution to solve them, right? What is this important form of structural change that Ben brings up to you, right? This means in this case, you're less able, when you give this veneer to these people, it's harder to hold them accountable, right? And when Ben tells you that in these cases, you have less ability to hold them liable for what they do. That means when you give these people ethos value, it's harder to like do things like convict them in court, right? Because you would see them as like more respect when they're doing something socially good. Therefore, let me just end by weighing this entire debate out for you, right? First of all, we definitely beat our opening because we don't give you a passive principle and we give you active harms to people who are harmed the most, right? We beat on them because of three reasons. One, on urgency, we access the harms to the most vulnerable in this debate who need to be helped right now, more than what they tell you on their side. Second, it's on probability, because prejudice is real. There are people in this very room who are sexist and misogynist, and changing their mind, however, is a big if. Compared to the guaranteed harms on our side. Finally, because we underreport the harms we talk about, so they're likely to be greater in magnitude than anything that they talk about on their side. These harms are therefore. What does this prove to you at the end of the debate? Even if this policy helps some have some privileged as heck realization or some social good, it isn't worth it and it isn't ethical if it harms the people we should care about the most and it harms the people who have no other means of recourse.